we're going to begin by talking about the naturally occurring, naturally developing characteristics of the children ages 6 to 12. And as we just heard from Dr. Montessori via Josephine, it is a rebirth. These characteristics change drastically about 6 years old. We'll speak about some of the ways that these characteristics are supported in the school. And we will see that the skills, the 21st century skills that children need today, these are social, moral, cognitive, emotional, that they are all nurtured and tended to in a Montessori environment. And so we'll explore together the role of the parent, the role of the teacher, and finally, towards the end of the session, talk about creating Montessori spaces at home, including the role of technology that you might choose to have in your home. So when I speak with parents of 6 to 12-year-old children, I often ask, what do you envision for the young men and women that your children are becoming? What traits do you as parents think are the most important to lay the foundation for a happy, productive, fulfilling life? And I can assure you that no one ever said college entrance exam scores when I asked that question. So take a moment just for yourself. And if you want to pop it in the chat, feel free. What do you envision for your children? What are these characteristics that are the most important to nurture? So I'm going to just pause for a moment, give you a moment of thinking. Self-reliance, independence and kindness, contributing members of society, lots of ideas, independence, responsibility, empathy, emotional awareness, being a good human being. Yes, beautiful, confidence. Yes, yes. So I've got a little slide here of some of the things that I hear too are the same kinds of things exactly that you all are thinking of too. The love of learning, the capacity to absorb large amounts of information, possessing a broad body of knowledge encompassing many fields, courage to take on large challenges and projects, specialized knowledge, skills that are integrated, independence, initiative, confidence, can-do attitude. They also say things like literacy and numeracy, skills to work with others, enjoyment of the hand, coordination and cooperation between the hand and the mind, enjoyment of the manual labor and mental effort, a view of the world. I see in the chat, happy, content, self-directed, yes. Parents value awareness of interconnection, right? This awareness that our choices have an impact on those beyond ourselves, right? Each individual and humanity have particular responsibilities. The ability to empathize, we saw that in the chat too. Develop a deep understanding of cultures and individuals, responding effectively to circumstances as they arise. And of course, physical, mental health, right? So worldwide, parents have really similar desires, and teachers too, adults in our community, similar desires to what we want for our children. So Dr. Montessori was fundamentally, she was an anthropologist. An anthropologist is a scientist who studies human beings. So she considered education much more than the transmission of knowledge. Instead, she saw education as an aid to life. So a formation of the total personality. So about 100 years ago, she found that children learned naturally when they were supported in their development. Montessori was also a medical doctor and a psychologist. So she was a trained scientific observer, and she used her observations to support the growth of children. So while working in a psychiatric clinic in Rome about 1900, Montessori viewed children in the institution, and she observed in these children, these were cognitively delayed children, she observed that they played with their leftover food that had fallen on the floor. And at first she thought, this is because they don't have solid nutrition or hygiene or development. But later she realized this was an educational problem rather than a medical issue. So what it was the children needed something to do with their hands. They needed some way to use their hands. And so Montessori felt that if children could be, she felt that children could be deeply enriched if they could be given some educational help, not just medical care. So she researched, well, what is being done to help children? First, this was with neurodiverse children, but then also later typically developing learners instead. So as a result of all these observations and study, in 1907, she founded a child care center in Rome. And that's where where the first principles of her method were established. And they're the same principles that we still follow today in Montessori schools worldwide. So Montessori rightly had a lot to say about healthy development for all of the phases of children's lives. So in terms of optimal development for our 6 to 12-year-olds, among other things, here's a couple of things she said. She said, the child becomes stable, ready to interact with others. The child has an understanding of the relationships between one's acts and the needs of others. And in short, Montessori envisioned children who are equipped in their whole being for the adventure of life. And that last one, I think, especially encapsulates a universal ideal for our youth, to view the panorama of life ahead as this adventure that calls to them, and to be ready to embark, to take on that adventure. So it's no surprise that today's adults want the same thing for their children that Maria Montessori observed a really long time ago. The social, technological, human-built, even natural environments, these are all changing at a pace perhaps unknown in human history, but we know that human nature remains the same. Human nature remains the same across time, across geography, across diverse cultures of individuals. So the necessity to adapt to change is not new. And so what I've got here on the slide now is a quote from a mid-20th century business professor calling to mind a 19th century principle that holds just as true today in our times. Here's what he said. He said, according to Darwin's Origin of Species, it is not the most intellectual of the species that survives. It is not the strongest that survives, but the species that survives is the one that is able to best adapt and adjust to the changing environment in which it finds itself. And so, incidentally, this was written about 100 years after Origin of Species was published, just as we're meeting today, maybe more than 100 years after Montessori discovered so much about the development of the child. So everything old is new again in some ways. And what applies in anthropology, human development and education, also this applies in business and marketing and space exploration and manufacturing. We continually see the interconnection of humans. We continually see this interconnection in their endeavors across time and space. All fields of knowledge are really, truly connected. So based on the foundational principles of development, Montessori education nurtures and instills and inspires qualities that adults hope for, parents and educators. This is now and in the future. And so let's explore how can we make sure our work with children, again, whether you're teaching or parenting or whether you're in some other relationship with children in your community, how can we make sure that work is the best possible aid to this adaptation that's necessary for this optimal life that we find ourselves in right now. So in a lecture in 1936, Dr. Montessori remarked that in traditional education, the whole system is normally based on two faculties of the human being. These were memory and abstraction. Now, in contrast, Montessori believed that an effective approach to education needs to be based on the characteristics of children. So she discovered these universal characteristics that are true of typically developing children and change in really predictable patterns throughout normal development. So they create certain stages from birth to adulthood. So as children reach the age of about 6, Montessori noted that they change. They change physically and they change psychologically. So they enter this new phase. She called this a plane. So they enter this new phase or plane of development. And so in Montessori, we call the time from about 6 years old to 12 years old the second plane of development, having followed the first plane of early childhood from birth to about 6 years old. And so our classroom for these ages are often called elementary, or some places in the world primary, but we're talking about this time period from 6 to 12 years old. And the child at this time in the class in the elementary does not just continue in the same way. So that means we have to approach them really differently than how we approach them in early childhood. So since we do have to base our approach on the child's characteristics, what are those characteristics of 6 to 12 years old children? The child at this time, the child in the second plane, Montessori discovered, uses a reasoning mind, uses powers of imagination to build herself. Social and moral development becomes important. And so again, changes in the child necessitate a change in approach and a change in environment. So that means if you're a teacher or a parent of a young child, and now this child is an elementary age child, your approach needs to change. We can't talk to the child in the same way as we did before. We won't get the same results. And this is the reason practically why the early childhood classrooms, why the spaces look so different than the communities for older children. So Dr. Montessori connected with this age group through the working of the universe, the wonder and the awe about the universe. So the approach that she made for the 6 to 12-year-old is called cosmic education. And cosmic education is the way she recognized to really stir up the child's interest and to appeal to those naturally occurring characteristics. And so unlike conventional education, each day is filled with hours of uninterrupted work time rather than segmented into particular blocks for subjects. So the child is exploring history and mathematics and art and geography and other subjects simultaneously. All of the lessons are interdependent, interdisciplinary. And so our ability to support our children is much stronger when we understand their natural development. We understand why they do the things they do. So first, the second plane of development, again, this time 6 to 12 years old, this is a time of great intellectual growth. The child is moving further from the concrete toward abstraction, and it's the time we offer the child the universe. Here's what Montessori said. She said, psychologically, there is a decided change in personality. And there is an unusual demand on the part of the child to know the reasons of things. Knowledge can best be given when there's eagerness to learn. So this is the period when the seed of everything can be sown. The child's mind being like a fertile field, ready to receive what will germinate into culture. So between the ages of 6 and 12, the intellectual potential is at its greatest. Second plane children have this mind that wants to know the reasons of things, that can think logically, that can make judgments, and that can come to a conclusion. And so in that quote, the seeds that we sow, those seeds are all of the ideas about the universe. There are interesting lessons, there are presentations, there's stories. Those are the things that spark interest in the universe. And so Montessori education remains just as much an aid to life during these years, 6 to 12, as it was during early childhood. But with this emerging intellect, a phrase Dr. Montessori overheard a child say was, "Help me to help myself." And so now with this emerging intellect, we can think of that, paraphrase it to be, "Help me to think for myself." That's the call to the 6 to 12-year-old. Help me to think for myself. So imagination is another trait of the 6 to 12-year-old. The children can learn and explore through imagination using their intellect. And so with the imagination, the child has eyes to see into the past, to see into the future, and to see concepts and ideas that aren't readily available to our physical eyes. And so this great power means we challenge the intellect to come to its own conclusions, to reason for itself, and create understanding. And so one thing that Montessori discovered was that our elementary age children naturally respond to deep interest, to lessons in story form. So she realized that stories make it possible to
Alison, you've muted.
Yes, it said the host muted me. But anyway, can you hear me okay now?
Yes,
Now I do. Yes, sorry,
Yeah.
and I didn't touch it, but
Yeah.
it must have done it automatically.
Oh, no problem. That's okay. So we're talking about stories. Did you hear the beginning of about stories here, right? So children have this great interest in lessons in story form. And so stories make it possible to introduce the child to the global vision, especially if they appeal to imagination and they appeal to reason. So Montessori was referred to by her son as the storyteller of the truth. And so one of the things that we strive to be as teachers is to be storytellers of the truth. And so Montessori, she gave the truth, but she made it more accessible to the children's minds by embellishing it a bit with fantasy, inanimate things like, rocks and plants, maybe had human sentiments or reasoning capabilities, things like that. So there's an organizational structure then within cosmic education. And a part of that is called the great stories. So these great stories enable the child's mind to work systematically. They're thought of as whimsical stories of the truth, told in this fantastic and imaginative way. So we've got 5 great stories. The first stories talk about the foundation of the universe and the coming of life, human beings' entrance. And then the last 2 great stories talk about the accomplishments of human beings, about language and mathematics or invention. So through these stories, we foster reverence towards the universe, as well as toward humanity, and those that came before us. So Montessori considered appreciation an important principle within cosmic education. Children continue to develop gratitude at this age, and we support that characteristic by emphasizing it through the stories. So we are honoring those named individuals and the anonymous human beings that came before us and all that they did to help us satisfy our fundamental needs. Some human beings, they took a risk, right? They walked toward the fire. Somebody did that the first time and probably didn't fare too well. And eventually some other humans were able to harness the fire. Some other human being took a risk and ate some berries And perhaps they were poisonous, and then the other people knew not to eat the berries. But that is, that those kinds of examples are the kinds of things we want our children to be aware of, that it's not just our famous human beings, but that each one of us has the capability to do something to support our humanity. The 6 to 12-year-old child needs to associate with others in some sort of organized activity. So this is a natural tendency for our 6 to 12-year-olds as well. And Montessori wrote about two necessary things. One is the development of individuality, but also that participation of the individual in the social life. So those are two things that we support. Again, that development of the individual and that individual within the social life. So one thing that happens is our second plane child turns away from the family a little bit, turn toward the peers, towards the classmates and the friends for further exploration. So these children, they move in groups, they naturally want to work together. Also, the child at this age is concerned with fairness and justice. The child wants to know what is right and what is wrong, and how this might differ depending on the individual or the community. And so here's one thing Montessori pointed out. She said, problems of right and wrong are characteristic of this age. Moral consciousness is being formed. She also talked about justice, the concept of justice being born at this age, simultaneously with that understanding of the relationship between the act of the self and the needs of others. So the second plane is when this conscience begins to develop. These ideas of right and wrong, recognition of values and rules. And very often at the beginning of this stage, our 6 and 7-year-olds in particular, they go through a little period of reporting to the teacher or the parent what the other children are doing. And so Montessori tells a little story about this where, she had one of her teachers had a child who was always coming to that teacher, telling all of the naughty things that the other children were doing and saying, is this good or is this bad? And the teacher was responding, telling on other children, this isn't right, stop doing that. But that child kept coming and kept coming and kept coming. And other times the child would refer to something positive, but always the same question, is this good, is this bad? And so it was only later that the teacher realized that the child was seeking to establish in their own mind, as a guide to their own behavior, what was good and what was bad in the class. And once the child had established this, the child stopped reporting all of this to the adults. So in short, the child isn't coming to the adult to say, oh, Prasanna's running in the hallway to get her in trouble. She's coming to the adult to see if running in the hallway is acceptable or not acceptable. So this reporting to the adult, this is a natural developmental milestone. And should be respected as such. So the child needs to hear what they've observed is okay or not okay, and the reason why. So if a child came to me and reported that about Prasanna, sorry to pick on you, Prasanna, no, you would say, no, it's not okay for Prasanna to run in the hallway because the floor is wet and she could slip and hurt herself. Or because the Children's House children, they're working on counting the 1,000 chain and running would be disruptive, or whatever the reason is. So that child is looking for how is the adult going to react? The child needs to understand what is deemed good, what is deemed unacceptable by society, and giving that reason to help to the intellect for understanding as the child is forming her own moral value structure. The second plane child wants to undertake huge projects, work with maximum effort, research the how and the why of everything that appeals. And so in Montessori, we call this effort great work or big work. So the great work, this is large endeavors that totally absorb the children in time, in space, or both. And so we can think of it as a little virtuous cycle, because this kind of work both depends on and also serves to further develop the 6 to 12-year-olds. And it's supporting imagination, intellect, reason, the power of abstraction. And what you're looking at here is some multiplication work that these 4 children have been doing. They've mixed together 2 different types of material, and then it made it in triplicate. So typically when the children would do a multiplication problem with the checkerboard, they would just have one of the boards that you see that has the wooden frame. But that board wasn't enough to satisfy them. So they've gone to the other classrooms in the school and borrowed 2 more checkerboards and put them all together. And then they've also gone to a separate piece of material. Those are little loose felt squares or paper squares or something that are spilling over on the carpet. And they've taken that material and laid it out so that they could do a huge multiplication problem that looks like it's got a 10-digit multiplier in here. And they've had to think about, well, how are the categories going to align properly? And those are the little white strips that you're seeing there, because it wouldn't just work to put one on top of the other, because the categories wouldn't progress in the correct order. So this kind of thing is this example of, well, what if we did it bigger? Or what if we did it more or longer? Or what if we tried it this way? That type of work is work that's very satisfying for the naturally occurring development of our 6 to 12-year-olds. And so to support this type of activity, again, this activity which is optimal for development, it's essential that the children have large chunks of time for big projects. And so this is, another reason why we have this daily uninterrupted time blocks. Often we've got 3 hours perhaps in the morning and then again in the afternoon. And there's not a call to switch subjects or studies after an hour. We don't go math for 45 minutes, history for 45 minutes, that sort of thing, in the same way that happens in a traditional school. So to aid them in this great work, this big work that they aspire to do, children have considerable physical stamina, stable health, and endurance. They've got a new direction for the energy of their bodies that in the first plane they were using for all of that physical growth. So movement and activity continue to be strong needs at this age. So one characteristic that emerges at this time is now the child doesn't want a fuss made over him. So when we think of the child in early childhood, maybe the 3 or 4-year-old, if they get hurt, you might not even be able to see a little scratch that they come to you and say, it's hurt. And they want a kiss and a hug, and they want a bandage attached to it, and you can't see it, anywhere. But the elementary child might have this like bleeding gash on their leg. And when you ask what happened, the child says, oh, she's fine. So we do need to care for the injury. We do need to support the children in that way, but we don't need to make that fuss anymore. That was so important developmentally for that younger child. Related to this, the second plane children often become untidy. They become messy, even slovenly sometimes. They dislike washing. I see lots of nods. You might have elementary children around your households, those that are nodding, because they're only going to change their clothes when mom says, you must change your clothes, or you must have a bath. So we need to be aware of this. And we can support it by setting limits and giving reasons. And sometimes that's a compromise together. One thing teachers often do is keep a mirror hung at child height near the entrance to the class. And so then the teacher could say something like, go have a look at your cheek in the mirror and see if something needs to be done. So then, when there's chocolate on the cheek or something like that. So instead of identifying the problem, giving the child the tool to independently care for herself. So we need to establish the expectation for the classroom as teachers and also at home as parents. Montessori actually called this age the age of bad manners. And so the children are not being rude because they want to hurt your feelings. They're breaking away from the family unit. This is part of how they join with their peers. And order provides security for our children. And transitions can be particularly difficult for children. By their very nature, transitions can disturb order by interrupting the children. So routine and predictability, these are important ordering tools for our children, for our 6 to 12-year-olds also. And the reason why is that they're beginning to make predictions and assumptions based on experience. So they're strengthening that developing reasoning capacity. So even though their bedroom may not look ordered, or they might have big piles of toys or work out, they still do need order around them. So in early childhood, the child needed an orderly environment, both in time and space. And the reason why is that child was constructing the order of the mind. But by the second plane, by the 6 to 12-year-old time period, the child no longer has a sensitivity to the external in order of the environment in the same way. The child's internalized that order. And this is because the 6 to 12-year-old is intellectually ordering now, ordering intellectually a huge amount of information. So if we insist that elementary children keep order in their spaces while they're working or while they're playing, it can slow down the activity to the point of losing interest. And you might have had that experience too, as a teacher or a parent. If the child has a really messy space and you ask them to tidy it when they're in the middle of whatever they're doing, they very often won't be interested in going back to what they were doing anymore. And so as a result, practically, we see the children's work much more disorderly at this age. So all over their workspaces, all over their, their bedroom, that kind of thing. And so we accommodate their natural development by allowing for this. But we also have to accommodate the community of the school, the community of the family, by always returning the work, returning the materials into a neat and orderly fashion after the work is finished. And so that's how we're both supporting the development, but also supporting that there's other people in this space too, of the home and of the school. So it doesn't mean that the classroom or the home should be disorderly. Children are still taking in impressions at this age. And so we still have beautiful classrooms and items on the shelf in orderly places, just like in early childhood. But we do want to keep in mind that it's the order of the mind, the order for the intellect that is taking precedence at this stage. So intellectually, our 6 to 12-year-olds are rapidly crossing into abstract thinking in many areas. So many areas that sometimes we as adults are tempted to think that children don't need to manipulate materials anymore, but that's false. The children do need to manipulate with their hands. They do need activities that are practical for life. Children need concrete objects, and they're drawn to the work of the hand just as much as our children that are birth to 6 years old. So we continue to provide purposeful, complex activities for both the hand and the mind. And as we go through our session today, you'll notice in the slides, there's really an emphasis on this work of the hand. You'll see the children using their hands in all sorts of different ways. So let's pause for a moment. How will what we've just talked about influence your work with children? Your work in your home with your children, or your work in your community, or your work in your classroom, or whatever your relationships are with children. So whether we are parents or teachers or administrators or others who are spending time with young people, our job is to support the children's entire growth. So this is the social, moral, cognitive, and emotional growth. And our work is to do this in healthy ways that lead to optimal development. So we're about helping life. Remember, Montessori talked about aiding life. And so what does life require right now in the 21st century? And so a good start is the list of traits that we began with, the kinds of things that parents say they want for their children, the kinds of things you put into the chat early in the session and I had up here on the slides. So now let's look at them again, and they're simplified into groups here. So we've got the ability to work with others, to have empathy, to have healthy relationships. So these are all skills in the social domain. We've got responsibility, respect for law, sense of universal and personal cosmic tasks. These are skills in the moral domain. There's a love of learning, big picture thinking, literacy. We think of these traits as part of what we might call the cognitive domain. And then, of course, independence, self-confidence, commitment, boldness to tackle large challenges and projects. These are all skills or traits in the emotional domain. And of course, we see overlap everywhere, don't we? In these generalized areas, we see overlap. But based on these broad categories, we can have a framework for thinking about the outcomes that we want for second plane children, the traits that Montessori observed and envisioned, which are still valued today, the traits that lead to adaptability in the face of change. So it's not just parents and teachers and community members that have these aspirations for children. In human resources, for employers, these kinds of traits are called soft skills, or sometimes called transferable skills, or interpersonal skills, or social skills. So hiring managers look for these kinds of traits too. They look for things like literacy and numeracy, time management, organization, oral and written communication, teamwork, creative problem solving, initiative, critical thinking, information gathering, adaptability, emotional intelligence. So these skills, they're a little hard to pinpoint, aren't they? They're hard to measure, they're hard to assess. They also cannot be taught or learned in any conventional way. Our children cannot memorize or abstract their way to politeness, for example, or abstract their way to creativity or initiative, organization, self-discipline. It even sounds silly to say it like that. What they need is experience, right? They need to learn to navigate their worlds. And our job is to provide plenty of opportunities to learn, to practice, and to master these kinds of soft skills, social skills. Perhaps today, more than ever, this is essential to adaptation to a changing world. And so within Montessori, we understand that it's not possible to transfer knowledge from one person to another person directly. So instead, our focus is to assist the human being to develop. That's what we do. We help the human being to develop. And this is an important distinction because the vast majority of educational philosophies begins with the question of how do we impart knowledge to the child? That's how most educational philosophies work. They say, how do I get what's in my knowledge base to the child? How do I impart knowledge to the child? But in Montessori, it's different. Instead, we know that each child learns through her own efforts, in her own way, at her own pace. So as a result, the Montessori teacher, the Montessori adult doesn't instruct in a conventional way. The adult is linking the child in the environment. The environment is the space psychologically and physically, the classroom, if you will. So we connect the child through stories, through materials, but the child must do her own learning. So let's look at each of these categories in some detail together. And we're going to start with the social development. So our elementary classes encompass at least 3 years of mixed ages of children. So our age groupings are 6 to 9-year-olds, 9 to 12-year-olds, or 6 to 12-year-olds. And the reason why the ages are the way that they are is because they share the same developmental characteristics. It's why you don't see a Montessori classroom of 4 to 8-year-olds, for example, in the same classroom, because they have different developmental characteristics. So in this elementary class, our presentations are given to small groups of children. And these small groups are determined by readiness and by interest. And it's from this approach that we can help the children practice organizing their own groups, organizing into their own little societies. So we're helping them to organize themselves. So for example, in a presentation about the body function of reptiles, we might have 5 children of various ages. And after that presentation, after that lesson, the children have some freedom to decide how do they want to follow on this work. How will they learn a bit more about reptiles? Will they repeat the exercise with the card materials? Will they research early reptiles on Earth? Will they build a model of the reptile's 3-chambered heart? Or maybe they'll think of something entirely different. So the children, they'll naturally want to work together. Remember, this is their nature at this age. So what that means is they need skills for navigating this work in the group. So in addition to learning about reptiles, they're learning about working together in a group. And so experiences like these will exercise the children's skills of negotiating, navigating, compromise. So specifically, we speak with the children about what group work means. So it means that we all share the work together. So if we're going to make a little booklet about nouns, we each write a list of our favorite fruits. And then one person in the group makes a cover and decorates it, and one person makes a back cover and decorates it, and somebody else is going to sew the binding of the little booklet together, and then we're all going to sign as co-authors of this book. So our environments, our 6 to 12 classrooms, are places where people need to talk, to work. And so that's why when you go in the classroom, it's not quiet. Sometimes this can be startling if you have a lot of experience with the early childhood, because it's pretty quiet when you go into the early childhood classroom, the children's house. And one reason is most of the work those children are doing is individual activities. But when you go in the elementary class, most of the work those children are doing are group activities. So the children need to express themselves to work. And they need to do it in a volume where all 30 or 35 of us can be talking. And so when a lot of children are working on different things, this is going to require some different degrees of concentration. And for this reason, we don't impose silence during the work cycle. The children need to be able to collaborate. They need to be able to speak about their work. However, we do need to speak in a volume that's going to help everybody to have concentration. The volume needs to be conducive to work. And so the way I explain this concretely to children is that my voice needs to be loud enough to reach your ear, but it doesn't need to be any louder than to reach your ear. That's what the volume needs to be, right? So if you're right next to me, if you're sitting right here, then my voice can be very quiet. But if you're way on the other side of the room, then maybe I should think about how I can get your attention. And probably the best way is for me to get up and walk on over there and have a conversation with you. So what you don't hear me say is use an indoor voice or use an outdoor voice, because that's very abstract for the children. We want to make very concrete the volume of the voice. The children need to understand what volume is appropriate for each particular situation and be able to practice modulating their voice. So another example of how we support social development is the way we employ the principle of limitation. So this means the materials that we keep on the shelves, the books, even these stories that the adult tells, the information we give is intentionally limited. And this is because the children need to leave the classroom. They need to enter the neighborhood or the community through what Dr. Montessori termed as going out. So this idea, going out, this extends far beyond seeking further information. So the children do go out and they interview the orthopedic surgeon to see how the hand works. Or they collect the mealworms from the pet store to feed the classroom gecko. So what going out is a small group of interested children. They make their own plans, including the logistical aspects around the location, around the transportation. This might be what route they're going to walk or what train they need to get there safely, that sort of thing. And this is very different, vastly different than a field trip or an excursion where the adult takes the whole class, interested or not, to the same location. So we don't really do that in Montessori. We do it very rarely. Instead, the going out is what the individual group of children needs to seek information or serve a need or serve the community of the classroom or outside, plus the development of responsibility and independence around all the arrangements. So going out supports the social skills of working in the group, navigating the public transportation, perhaps, or making a formal telephone call, or asking an expert for information or for help, that kind of thing. So the child at this age is ready for these social interactions beyond the family, beyond the school. And so this development includes knowing the practicalities of the social interaction. So this is what we think of as the practical life now for our 6 to 12-year-old children. In early childhood, we do a lot of exercises of practical life in the children's house. Now, our 6 to 12-year-old, they're developing their practical life around knowing the social customs, knowing the societal expectation. So next, let's talk about moral development. So earlier in their Montessori life, these children, they had the freedom to choose and to act within an appropriately limited environment. So in the children's house, this is that classroom community for our 3 to 6-year-olds. That's where the children have had some of these kinds of experiences. And we know that opportunities to choose will develop a child's inner discipline. So we want to give the child opportunities to choose. And how we start that really early. Literally, you can start it, when the child's 1 or 2 years old. Do you want to wear the pink shirt or do you want to wear the blue shirt? So what I want you to notice is I didn't say, which shirt do you want to wear? But instead we're limiting the 2 choices. So very early, children can begin to learn how to make choices and learn how to feel the result. So in this early childhood in the children's house, the inner discipline is often physical. It's toward the self and caring for the environment, like blowing the nose or carrying a tray while walking somewhere, or sweeping up a spill, returning material to the shelf. That's the kind of experience that happens in early childhood. But what has to happen in elementary is what Dr. Baker called an enlargement of the field of action. So we're responding to this new focus with continued grace and courtesy presentations that are suitable now for the older children. So these are lessons that help the children to navigate social interactions in the classroom and beyond, with care, with confidence, with empathy. So these kinds of presentations help the children with their moral development. So in the young children's community in early childhood, it was important not to bump into someone as you were walking by them. But now it's important not to offend someone with your words, with your deed. And remember, because this age can be considered the age of rudeness, in Dr. Montessori's words, the age of bad manners is what she said. We're going to model and provide lessons for the children on societal and cultural expectations. So early lessons include how to invite someone to work with you, how to decline that invitation, how to accept it, or perhaps what qualities are needed to be a good friend, or how to welcome a guest to the classroom by offering tea or offering coffee. But later work in this area is going to expand to the skills that are needed to function in the digital age, social interactions through technology, digital correspondence, perhaps texting and email. This has its own set of rules, right? Its own etiquette that children need to learn now to function in our society. So our children manage their own community, and that also supports their moral development. They decide how to solve issues of the classroom, like how do we ensure that there's molasses for a viscosity experiment for everybody that wants to do it, rather than have the first 3 children use up all the molasses that we've put aside for the entire week. So this is like a real world problem those children need to figure out how to solve in their classroom community. So with modeling and support, children decide how to manage the lunch cleanup procedures, how to manage the care of the coat room, for example. So the law and the order that exists in the cosmos. And for example, the ideas that the children experience through experiments, things like liquids always press downward and sideways, but liquids never press up. Another law in the cosmos is leaves give off oxygen. So that kind of law and order, that appeals to the developing value structure of the 6 to 12-year-old child. Also, when the children go out, when they leave the classroom, they see human beings working in our communities. They see human beings repairing roads or collecting tickets for the bus or trimming the hedges. They see humans driving on the left side of the road, right, in India. What chaos would occur if half the people drove on the right side of the road? And I know that happens sometimes too. So it's maybe not the best example for driving in India, but there is general law and order. It does work, doesn't it? It looks a little chaotic to somebody who didn't grow up driving in India like me, but the system works. More or less, people follow the law, if you will, the structure. So in our classrooms, starting early in the school year, the children discuss what type of place do we want this to be? What type of place do we want our classroom to be? And if we want a place that's fun to be, where people treat each other kindly, where we all care for the materials, what types of guidelines do we need to establish? So we have this conversation with the children. We clearly articulate the reason for each expressed guideline. Remember, knowing the reasons for things, this is a strong characteristic at this age. So the question to the children is, this is a place of work. So what do we need to do in order to be sure we're enjoying our work? So what you're seeing on the slides are some of the classroom rules that a particular classroom came up with to this effect. So they will have these conversations and then make a little chart or a booklet or somehow post or publish to the group, and everybody in the class will sign. So in this class, respect your lessons, pay attention, no talking, is some of the things that the children thought were important to remember here. So we're also supporting cognitive development. So eagerness to learn is both a characteristic of the second plane child, and if it's nurtured, it's an outcome too, right? It's an outcome of Montessori education. So children show attachment to abstract ideas if they have arrived at them through activity. So what we need to remember is that at the base of abstraction has to be experience, has to be some experience for that abstraction to truly be meaningful. So one thing we do then is we provide many demonstrations, many charts, things that are meant to strike the imagination of the 6 to 12-year-old, as well as concrete materials that support the development of understanding. Children explore the aspects of human beings. They explore the universe. And this exploration now for 6 to 12-year-olds, it's no longer just with the senses. So our young children are exploring with their senses. But now our 6 to 12-year-olds, they become interested in what they can't see anymore, what they can't touch, what they can't experience with their senses. They're interested in what are children across the world doing right now, where they live, for example. So the child's no longer satisfied with exploring just what's visible. The child has to explore what's invisible. And so our impressionistic charts don't give a factual reality, even though they introduce a factual concept. The charts are intended to give an impression and to stimulate the imagination. So the charts illustrate a concept or idea, and often personification conveys a key point. So what you're looking at here is the inner workings of a leaf. And so what you're seeing is many little guys, little people, if you will, caring for different aspects of the smooth operation of food production. And so these charts are big. I know it's hard to see on the slide, but in the classroom, it's maybe, a meter on one side by 3/4 of a meter on the other. So they're big charts, big that you'd hold up in your hands or lay out. So they're giving big ideas. So this chart embodies the idea of photosynthesis, and it's designed to strike the imagination of the child, the 6-year-old at first. So we tell a little story about what happens in the leaf. So you might have a small group of children, maybe 5 children, and we're all sitting next to each other, and perhaps the adult is holding the chart, or it's on a little easel or something like that. And we might point out some things on the chart and talk about it. So we see water being brought up into the leaf, and I might be pointing at the little blue elevator, and the water that contains 2 particles, hydrogen, and 1 particle, oxygen, it's being separated. You can see that there in the middle. They're pulling apart. And then gas that comes from the air, that's carbon dioxide, and it's mixed with the hydrogen. And you can see the little mixing bowl in the middle. Together, they're cooked into plant food, and the oxygen that was not used, it's thrown off as waste. And that's the little brown elevator that's going down. So does this really happen? No, of course not, right? This is a metaphorical idea of photosynthesis, but it's an idea that a 6-year-old can understand in a way that if we give the elements present in the formula for photosynthesis that a 6-year-old wouldn't have any relationship with. It's only through this imagination that the child can grasp in reality. So we follow stories like this with experiments, with various studies now about the leaf, about the job of the leaf. So let me give some examples of concrete materials that also support the cognitive development. So what you're looking at here are 2 metal plates. They're little puzzles. Montessori called them materialized abstractions, and they're of the Pythagorean theorem. So the children first discover that the 2 squares that are built on the legs of a right angled triangle have the same value as the square built off the hypotenuse. So this is a sensorial experience. They're moving pieces back and forth. This is the one that you're seeing on the left here to prove the equivalence. And then in the second plate, which comes a little later, the squares are divided into tiny little squares, right? The children see not only do the squares built off of the legs of the right angled triangle equal the other square, they take up the same space. And so we're going to call one of those squares A and one of them B, and then the biggest square built off the hypotenuse we're going to call C. So this is a mathematically precise puzzle of the formula A squared plus B squared equals C squared. And we can see mathematically, we can prove it. Our 9 squares plus 16 squares equals 25 squares. So you might, as a child, if you didn't go to Montessori school, you might have memorized a squared plus b squared equals c squared and applied it and used it, but had no idea they were actually squares until today. And you would not be the first adult that has had that realization in a Montessori training course or in a lecture like this, that this is not uncommon of how children have been expected to learn, but one of the big differences of how we approach it in Montessori. So a later exploration with the Pythagorean theorem comes with a material called the constructive triangles. And this is a material that's first used early with our 3 and 4-year-olds to explore shape and dimension in a sensorial way. But when the elementary children use this material, the mathematical precision of the material allows them to build a variety of shapes off the right-angled triangle. So they build parallelograms and rhombi and hexagons, and they make the same proof that you're seeing here with the squares, but with other shapes. So in other examples, they work with concrete materials. They discover formulas for the area of the triangle. They discover the rules for divisibility by 3 and by 4 and by 2 and other numbers. They discover words of Greek origin spell the sound with the letters PH, but other languages that contribute to English spell it with the letter F. So rather than being told these rules or these abstractions by the adult, the child is doing her own learning. She's using the materials, drawing conclusions, learning through her own experience. And on that experience, she's building abstraction and finally understanding. So you might be noticing that in some of the examples I'm giving, I'm using questions rather than telling. And this is a strategy that the teachers and parents can use too. And the reason why we question rather than tell is the purpose is to engage the reasoning capability of the child. Then they formulate their own answer rather than you, the adult, telling them the answer. So one thing we might say in the classroom would be something like, you know, it's time for lunch. Okay, so we say something like, what do we need to do to prepare for lunch? And then the children are going to talk about it or answer. That's really different than saying, as the adult, it's time for lunch, put away your work, push in the chairs, get out the food, that sort of thing, right? And so you can do that at home too. It's time to get ready for bed. You know, what do you need to do to get ready for bed? Or if that's too big of a question, you can be in the washroom saying, it's time to brush your teeth. What do you need to do to brush your teeth? You know, now what do we need to do next? That kind of thing. So the questioning for our 6 to 12-year-olds is helping them to strengthen their independence in thinking. Part of the support we provide is we want the children to discover the solutions rather than giving the children the answers. This is about what's going to help them be independent in their thinking too. So another example of an approach that supports the cognitive development would be another little lesson, this time about language. So when we explore the noun, one little game we play is the adult asks a small group of children to collect some various items. So the adult asks for perfume, a cup of tea, a book, a bell, maybe the 1,000 cube, and the children go off into the classroom or maybe even to the class next door or the office, and they collect these things, and they have no difficulty with this task, okay? But they come back, and now the teacher, now the guide sends them back for some other things. And she asks for aroma, for growth, for beauty, softness, humor. What do you think happens now? The children, they wander around with a little bit of confusion, right? They might bring a plant for growth, or they might find a really young child and say, this is youth, things like that. I once had a child giggle into my hands for humor. Of course, the children begin to understand, hey, not all nouns are the same. Some are abstract. We can know them in our minds, but we cannot fabricate them as objects. And so this is a discovery now, and this is really different than the adult just telling the children, here's the difference between concrete and abstract nouns, right? And this type of activity is common in the Montessori class. It fosters both the love of learning and a creative approach to thinking. So Montessori for the 6 to 12-year-olds embraces a variety of response modes. And this also strengthens the children's abilities for flexible thinking. So one group might construct a diorama about the shelter of early humans. Another group might put on a fashion show highlighting different clothing needed to live in different climate zones. So these kinds of explorations, they're a multi-sensory experience, and they go far beyond a conventional school worksheet or a quiz or something like that. They strengthen the adaptable thinking that we need in our world right now, thinking that's both critical and creative. It's concrete and abstract, it's rational and emotional. And so, by the way, it's worth noticing what you're not seeing in all of the example slides. You're not seeing individual children working with A4 paper. Instead, the photos are full of experiential multisensory learning. The photos are work of the hands, or perhaps the results of the work of the hands. So in Montessori, we're keeping in mind the child's learning process as well as the quality of the work, not the quantity or the product. We're providing the proper tools and techniques for executing written work. So you're seeing beautiful projects, examples of this great work that are reflective of their invested time, of their energy, of their learning, rather than just a page in a notebook. So we know that significant development and work takes place in a Montessori classroom, yet there's not always a tangible product. There's not a conventional paper trail. And this idea process, this is a really important one to understand. If you think back to that slide I showed earlier of the great work with the multiplication work, where there were the 3 checkerboards and the children had borrowed the materials from other classes, that problem probably took them an hour or 2 or 3 to do. And in the end, perhaps they wrote it on a piece of paper, or perhaps they didn't. But that paper would not be reflective of the work and the learning and the thinking that had to go into that particular project. So finally, we also support emotional development. So I have another quote from my mentor, Dr. Kay Baker. She said, as the child gains experience and knowledge, the mind understands the effects that actions have on others. When this understanding becomes totally conscious to the adult, the child is able and willing to forego and forbear, a key ingredient in social harmony. So let me highlight that part, to forego and forbear. That means to give up one's own desires for the sake of another, or for the sake of others. So that kind of self-control, that's a sign of a high state of emotional development, right? To give up your own desire for someone else or for the group. And that's only possible with practice in a social context. So the Montessori Elementary provides the social context that best fosters the emotional traits that we want for our children: independence, self-confidence, commitment, boldness to tackle those challenges and projects. So our classrooms are built around opportunities that support independence at every moment of the day. So we have 30 or maybe 35 children and 1 teacher in a class, specifically because the more adults present, the fewer opportunities there are for the children to be independent. No matter how well trained and thoughtful and experienced those adults are. Again, more adults, the fewer opportunities for independence. Practically, we want the children to get sick of waiting for us and go to each other to find the answer. That's what we hope will happen. So when there is more than 1 adult, and there are sometimes, and there are good reasons for that sometimes, and sometimes it has to do with the law in the country that says you need a certain amount of adults ratio, things like that. It's essential that the adults are busy with their own work so that they're not too available and ready to help the children. The trained guide knows exactly when to intervene so that helping becomes a support to learning rather than an obstacle to development. And that's something to keep in mind. If we help too much as parents or teachers, we can be an obstacle to development because then the child doesn't get her own chance to do whatever that thing is. That's true of any age. So we want to keep that in mind deeply for our children. So I'm not quite ready to show that one yet. Let's go back. So we create a climate where the children are taking ownership of their classroom. They want to take care of it. And this includes caring for plants, for pets, caring for each other in the community. And as children become more responsible for themselves, and then they become more responsible for the other members of the class and the other members of the community, they begin to consider now, how can they be of service to a wider society of the community, outside of the classroom, outside of the school, our neighborhood, that sort of thing. The child has experienced serving the family and the school community and derives satisfaction from this. And so if the children have experienced this freedom to serve others, first in some small ways and then in some larger ways, eventually they start to recognize that are the people in the wider environment that can benefit from their help. So through service, the child is developing this awareness and then a responsibility for the ways that they can contribute to society. All right, so here's another pause. Here's another chance to help you integrate some of the things we've been talking about. So how will what we've just talked about influence your work with children in your community? So these skills that we need to be functioning members of society today, emotional and social and cognitive skills. How is that, what will we take from what we've just heard? So we'll do another little breakout, another short breakout. Let me reply. Just one little question. Am I hearing correctly? 35 students and only one teacher? Yes, you are hearing correctly. In fact, Montessori wrote that she had her best results with 42 children, I think, or 40 or 42 children. She writes about that. Yes, you're hearing correctly. And it's because of the way that the classroom is functioning. The children are relying on each other, and the adult doesn't need to give every single presentation to every single child because the children are doing so much learning from each other. And I'll talk about some of these kinds of practicalities a little bit later in the talk too. But yes, many children, a single teacher. It's a shift in parent thinking very often, that we sometimes think, oh, the more attention they get from the adult, the better. But no, the more proper attention they get, which is letting them develop for themselves, and that is true. But that is served with fewer children. Fewer adults, more children. So let's have a little breakout. So Ruby, let's go 4 or 5 people in a group this time. And that will alleviate, I know some people had sort of trouble connecting or only had one partner, things like that. And I think we'll have better odds. And again, if you would just have a moment of reflection with your peers, how will any of this influence your work with the children in your communities of the home or your schools, or elsewhere in your community? And we'll go about 6 minutes again, and then we'll come back and I'll talk about the role of the adult. We'll start with the teacher in some more specific terms. All right, so Ruby, whenever you're ready, we can go into those groups. Thank you.
Yes, I'm not ready, I think.
Hope you had some good connections with each other and a moment to synthesize. You know, we're covering a lot of stuff in a short amount of time, relatively speaking, and so it's important to build in a little processing time here as well. So let me continue now more about the role of the adult, and first the teacher and then the parent, and you'll see there's overlap, of course, between the role of the adult. But we've talked so far about many ways that the Montessori Elementary supports the naturally occurring characteristics of the 6 to 12-year-old children, the social, moral, cognitive, emotional domains. So let me speak a little bit more about the role of the adult. In particular, the role of the teacher is to be responsible for the child's education. So that person is ensuring that the child has been supported to know certain things at certain times. The adult also prepares the environment. And so this is the classroom, and that environment is both a physical one, so literally the shelves and the materials, the space, but also the psychological one, a place with emotional safety, a place with kindness, that kind of thing. So we do this by deeply understanding the nature of the child and giving opportunities for independence and responsibility. So the teacher's role, part of the role, is to keep a delicate balance between the giving of presentations and trying to capture interest, and with keeping the children working, keeping the children reflecting. So the children do need to be working. That's part of cosmic education. So besides igniting interest, there's something more that we offer, and that is liberty or freedom. We give freedom to the child within this prepared environment, within this structure that's going to help bring about growth in the child. So the freedoms and the corresponding responsibilities in the elementary class, they reflect the development of independence that's been achieved now at this age. So in particular, the children are free to move about the classroom. We also expect that they will want to move and explore outside the classroom by participating in going out. And the concrete aspects of the going out, like how to use the phone and how to ride the bus, that sort of thing, that prepares the child for freedom and responsibility too. And each time we give the children freedom within the limits of the classroom environment, we're giving the child an opportunity to develop independence that they need to live in the world. So in our classes, the children are free to communicate. They're free to choose their work partners, the people they're going to work with. They are free to choose where they want to work, where they'd like to sit. They're free to choose their activities. They're free to choose the duration. How long are they going to do these activities? And so the children need this freedom to act by themselves, and they also need the opportunity to fail to act. That means they need freedom to make mistakes, freedom to try again. The child has the freedom to act independently by oneself, for oneself, without unnecessary help or interruption. The child is free to work, to concentrate, to build the personality, to develop. And the children can work in their freely chosen groups, meaning they're choosing the people in the group that are going to work together. Remember, we're giving the skills to work in groups. Also, the child has the responsibility to act within given limits determined by the group. So providing all these freedoms does not mean the children can waste their time all day. We have to have high expectations. Montessori wrote extensively about this. What's the use of giving freedom if it's the freedom to develop deviations, she said. So that means that we're giving freedoms, but we're going to interrupt when those freedoms are not used in ways that are productive for development. So along with each freedom goes a corresponding responsibility. So for example, the freedom to talk goes the responsibility with it, that the conversation has to be worthwhile, has to be relevant to the work at hand, it has to be constructive. Just because you have the ability and the freedom to speak doesn't mean you can say anything you want at any time or place. So the teacher will interrupt disrespect, will interrupt extraneous conversation if it's not actively worth the child's time and energy, if it's not contributing to the work. So let's use an example about the freedoms and responsibilities that you and I together have right now in our prepared environment of the Zoom workshop today, of the IMF hosted workshop, in the same context of the freedom to communicate. So I have this freedom with you, this freedom to communicate, but along with it, I've got some certain responsibilities. So just because I've got the freedom to communicate does not mean I can say whatever I want to, however I want to right now. I have to talk about things that are relevant to the audience, to you, parents, teachers, things about Montessori, things about child development. That's what the responsibility is around that. I can't spend 3 hours talking about my vacation plans or the quilts I'm sewing, even though I'm interested and excited about those things, right? I also can't use profanity. I can't be disrespectful. I can't be mean to you. I have to choose words that are going to be more or less acceptable to the professional circumstances that we are sharing right now. And those words might be really different. If I was at the dinner table with my husband, the kinds of things I might be able to say, the language, the particular terminology, that might be different for our children too, what they can say at home compared to the language that's acceptable to the community of the classroom. I also can't spend an extra hour on the topic. We've agreed that it's going to be about 3 hours today. So even though I might have more to say, I have the responsibility within the freedom to communicate to be with you for about 3 hours. And you've got some responsibilities too within the prepared environment that we share. One is that you have to keep your microphone muted to cut your background noise so other participants can hear unless you're actively speaking. You have the freedom to ask questions, but they need to be generally about the topic we're sharing. Child development, Montessori, that kind of thing. You can't ask me, about, I don't know, what I mean, you could ask, but we probably wouldn't answer the question about something that was off the topic. If we were in person, say we were in a lecture hall together, you might have the freedom to receive a phone call on your cell phone, but you would have the responsibility to excuse yourself, to exit the room, as to not disturb the speaker, not disturb your peers, to the audience, people sitting next to you. So the point is here, we've got this freedom for communication, but we've got limits that are established here within the prepared environment. In this case, the prepared environment is the Zoom lecture. But for our children, the prepared environment is the classroom, or the prepared environment is the home. And so sometimes parents are concerned about these freedoms. They wonder, how do we know that the children are learning? If we don't give the children tests, how do we know? We as teachers, we're asking the parents to trust the children and the teachers. However, this trust is based on a very careful plan. And even though in Montessori classrooms, we don't align curriculum with assessment in the same way that happens in conventional education, it's not to say that the adult doesn't have a structured plan to guide the teaching. So when teachers take the teacher training, take the Association Montessori International Teacher Training, they write and illustrate extensive teaching manuals in all areas. We call these albums. And they're about development, they're about psychology of the child. What we're talking about now forms the basis of that study. They also outline different flexible options, individual progression through various materials, through various academic structures. And the approach is designed to appeal to the child's characteristics. And the adult's also familiar with the public school curriculum or the national curriculum, whatever the societal standards are, to ensure that the children are meeting regular competencies in reading and math and writing in particular. And so there's this individualized plan that the Montessori guide is providing. And this is based on the idea that we're guiding a group, but it's a group of individuals. And we can adjust this plan. The child or the teacher uses a variety of systems to do that. So there's really two main types of assessment in the Montessori elementary class. One is that the teacher scientifically observes So the teacher has extensive training on observation, how to scientifically observe. So this is not just looking, it's a deep study of what we see, how to objectively note it, and then how to develop plans with that. And we observe sort of all day, every day. Within the lessons, we observe the child's work, both the process and the product of the work, the multifaceted classroom, all of that. And then secondly, the other big part of the assessment is the child is led to discover the process of self-evaluation. So this occurs through kind of three tools that the child is using. There's a work journal. This is a record of the choices of work that the child is making. There's a regular meeting with an individual child and the adult, the teacher. And then there's an awareness of the societal expectation, again, the national standards or the public school curriculum, if you will, depending on where you live. So again, we are emphasizing in the Montessori environment opportunities that allow independence. So we're giving the child the tools for her own self-assessment. That's how she becomes independent, rather than relying on external sources like the adult. And so this daily record, the work journal that the child keeps, generally that child is scheduling her own time throughout the day, making her own choices. And then concurrently, the adult is going around to small groups of children and giving presentations. So that's generally how the flow works in the classroom. So in the journal, the child is writing the time she began an activity, the end, and the type of work. So it might say 2 pages about characteristics of mammals, 9:05 to 9:45, something like that. So another way that the children are developing this responsibility while still being free, while still having these freedoms in the environment, is that we do keep a copy of the national standards on the shelf. These are the things that by the time the child is 12 years old, she would have learned in a conventional classroom in the community. And we talk about this. So it's not a year-to-year checklist. It's by the end of this cycle, the 3 or 6 year cycle. And the children have responsibility in learning these things. And then finally, the teacher and the child regularly meet to discuss the child's activities in the classroom. And so this might be weekly for newer children or younger children, for experienced children with more responsibility and independence developed maybe every 2-3 weeks, something like that. And so the child will bring their work, their finished work, work in progress, and the work journal. And so the teacher and the child are going to review the work journal together, and they're going to talk about the manner in which the time is used, where the child's strengths and challenges lie, that kind of thing. So the teacher's helping to create an avenue for improvement, for awareness. So the journal serves as a means to see and track and assess efforts. It helps the child become accountable for their time. So the child can see for herself productivity or efficiency or not, right? So the conversation might be, I see you spent 2 hours on long division. Is that the right amount of time? And the child might say, yes, we worked on, 7 problems and they had 4-digit divisors and et cetera. Or they might say, no, we got distracted and we got, talking about, whatever the hottest TV show is that we both watched last night, or things like that. And so this is how then the adult can help the child to, redirect and use the time. So it's these 3 tools: that journal, that regular meeting with the teacher, and awareness of societal standards that allow the child to have the freedoms and develop independence within the classroom. This is how it provides the structure for the child's learning. And so I'm just noticing one. I'm not checking everything in the chat. We'll come back to some of the questions later, but I'm noticing one. What if the child isn't keeping the journal? Then they don't have the freedom to be choosing their work anymore, right? The freedom is to choose the work, but the responsibility is that you're working. And if you haven't recorded your work because you're not working, then you need to sit by me for a little while and I'll choose the work for you. So there are a variety of ways that then the adult has to make sure that the child is developing the responsibility and developing the independence. So the artistry of being the guide is making sure that the child has as much support as they need, but not more than they need. So if I tell those children what they should be doing, but they don't need that support from me, this is a hindrance to their development. This is getting in the way of them fully reaching their potential. But if I don't tell a child who needs support making a choice, who needs support working or writing it in the journal, then I've abandoned that child. So that's the artistry. And this is what teachers study deeply through the teacher training courses, and then also what they practice throughout their career, and why, continued professional development is so important in our communities as well, to remember some of these things and get support when, when challenges. So let's talk more about freedom and responsibility, in particular in the home. So freedom and responsibility continues in the home. In fact, actually, it starts in the home, doesn't it? Before the children even go to school. So what this means for our 6 to 12-year-olds is each child needs a home responsibility that contributes to the society of the family. So for example, the child could sweep the walk, or the child could set the table, or walk the dog, or watch younger children play in the park. And even if you have help in your household with cooking or with cleaning, these are tasks that children should learn how to do too. This is going to foster their independence. The elementary children, they can prepare their own snacks. They could make their own bed, tidy the spaces in the home, the bedroom or the toys in the living room, that sort of thing. Often what we see at this age is that the children will like the food that other people prepare for them, or that they themselves prepare, better than what the parents prepare for them. And as a result, it's a perfect time to involve the children in cooking food or growing food if you have the space for that, even just if you have a pot to grow some herbs or something like that on a patio or something. It's not uncommon for the children to be critical or picky about food that they used to like. This is part, again, of that pushing away into the wider society of the detachment from the family. Other practical activities around the home, like repair work, can be suitable. Maybe mending a garment, or painting the fence, or hanging artwork, caring for plants. Anything that for the care and maintenance of the home can be suitable and can meet the developmental needs of the work of the hand, of movement, of contributing to the group. Additionally, service to the society, maybe helping an elderly neighbor or volunteering at a pet shelter. These kinds of things will support the experience of entering society. So in regards to the home environment, the physical environment, think of ways that you can set up your home to support the independence of the children. So for example, can the children get a snack when they're hungry? Or are the snacks kept in a very high cupboard, or in a container that's too hard for a small hand to open on their own? Things like that. What you want to eliminate is the adult support that makes that child reliant on you or other adults in your household to get the snack. You want to have that opportunity for the child to, when she's hungry, to be able to help herself. And another example, is there child-sized furniture in the home? So we want the children to be able to have the chair or have the toy shelf or the bookshelf at a level that the child can see. So the very young children, we're going to hang the artwork very low on the wall, so the children can see the artwork, or they can see into the mirror without needing to be lifted up to see it in some of their spaces. We can limit the amount of toys or books available and maybe put them on rotation, or not have quite as many. That's going to make the children more interested in the things that are there, instead of the abundance where things get forgotten. So these are some of the areas in which you can analyze your approach at home and make adjustments in support of independence for the children, and also inclusion of the children in ways that they can take care of their body and take care of their mind and develop their hands and that sort of thing. Sometimes parents and teachers forget this reasoning capability that becomes active at this stage. So our 6 to 12-year-olds, remember, they want to know the how and the why of everything. And this can sometimes stretch the patience of adults when we don't remember this important point of development. It maybe seems like the children are being disrespectful or arguing with you with a series of questions, when actually this is their very nature from 6 to 12. So when the children ask why, it's important to give an actual valid reason. So for example, you tell your child it's 9 o'clock, it's time to go to bed. And then you need to give a reason, an actual legitimate reason. So it might be children your age need 10 to 12 hours of sleep in order to support healthy bone development. Or if you don't have enough sleep, you'll feel groggy in the morning and you won't be able to focus on your football practice, or whatever the actual reason is. Saying it's time for bed, why? Because I'm the parent and I told you, that's not an actual reason. Right? That isn't effective strategy because it won't satisfy the natural development. So if you find yourself saying that as the reason, and that's the only reason, then it's worth looking at, well, why do you have those rules in the first place? What can we eliminate some of that structure? So the reasons would be something for safety or health of the child or the family. So, sometimes children are comparing themselves to their siblings. Why does my sister get to do this and I don't get to do that? The reason isn't because I said so. There's actually another reason under that you're not saying. And the reason is it's more developmentally appropriate for your sister, maybe, or, you've got this other responsibility or whatever it is. But that's what's really worth analyzing and sharing the reasons. The child might not agree. That's okay. But you're suiting their development with an answer that gives the reason. So generally speaking, in Montessori, we do not give traditional or conventional homework in a Montessori school. The exception is a request that the children are reading daily or that they're hearing books read aloud to them daily throughout childhood. So in short, my ask to parents always is to support the child to read or to learn at home every day. Do some sort of learning or reading at home every day. And we know that scientists know that reading has a huge impact on vocabulary development. So if your child's not reading yet, or if your child's a struggling reader or a budding reader, reading aloud is absolutely essential. The average child learns about 2,700 words per year, or about 7 new words daily. And reading is a significant influence on the development of vocabulary. So again, if they can't read for themselves, then somebody else should do the reading and or listening to digital books and things like that. There's more complex vocabulary in books than even the most articulate speakers are using on a regular basis. This quote comes from The Psychology of Reading and Language Comprehension by Justin Carpenter. So additionally, even once the children know how to read, reading together strengthens bonds of love. This comes from Megan Cox Gordon. A tsunami of neurochemical benefits gets unleashed when a parent and child cuddle together over a book. Stress and anxiety downshift, for starters. As soon as the parent puts his or her arms around the child, hormones flood their bloodstreams, relaxing them and engendering mutual trust. Even as the reader and listener are enjoying their bouquet of neurochemicals, their brain activity is synchronizing, creating literal order and connection in a process known as neural coupling. So in short, what this means is there are actual changes in the body that promote not only the benefits toward literacy, but also the benefits of the relationship in which reading aloud occurs. And I'm talking about reading anything aloud together, reading magazines and newspaper articles and chapter books and fiction and nonfiction and anything. If you're interested in learning more about the benefits of reading aloud, I really like this book. It's called The Enchanted Hour by Megan Cox Gordon. So regarding homework, In some very exceptional cases, an individual child might need practice at home to support the establishment of a particular skill. But we don't give an assignment to the entire class. Homework does not prepare the children for homework. The development of independence and responsibility, the children seeing what needs to be done and doing it, and then being able to go about it. That's what's going to help them for homework when they go to another environment. So if your child does need additional practice or repetition at home on something that's really difficult for them, maybe memorization of multiplication tables or something like that, the first thing is to chat with your child's teacher about this and make sure that you and the teacher are on the same page about how to support their child. But I often ask parents, can you work with your child for 5 minutes a day and not get frustrated? That's the first question. That both parent and child should find that enjoyable. I see lots of smiles, so this must be relevant for some of you. So I'm talking about a short and simple exercise, and then we move on to something else. And sometimes that's not possible in the family unit in an area of struggle for the child. And so if yes, you can work without being frustrated with each other, then you can do some repetition, and perhaps the teacher can direct you to what's appropriate for your child. Then you move on to something else. But if those times become difficult on the parent and child relationship, that's important information for your child's teacher. That's important information because multiplication facts are not worth a regular conflict at home every day. Right? You have other ways to strengthen your bond with your children that that are more important than that. And there are other ways also to strengthen multiplication without that, if that's what it's coming down to. So one way is to accommodate a keen interest that your children display. So for example, the child might be really interested in plants and ask you to take them to the botanical garden to see different plants or something like that, or the local art museum because they have a piqued interest. So the parent might not be able to accommodate all of these requests every time, but we want to respond with encouragement and enthusiasm and help the children to continue their interests and continue their learning at home. Another way that parents can support the work of their child is by having a non-digital clock, so analog clocks in the home. And when the children ask what time it is, figure it out together. So what this is looking at the clock and making an analysis, giving some clear instructions. Something like, where do we see the little hand? Yep, it's on the 4, so I know the hours for something. The big hand is between the 5 and the 6. So let's count the minutes around the clock. And maybe you're counting individual minutes or by 5s or something. But go through the whole process of how you're reasoning through how to tell the time. Otherwise, it kind of looks like magic sometimes when children don't understand what the actual processes are that we're using for things. Parents can support writing at home whenever possible as well. Items like letters to neighbors and friends, notes, lists for the grocery. These are ways for the children to practice on the handwriting and follow some interests. And in regards to writing, when the children are very young, perhaps 2 and 3 and 4 years old, it's important that the tools those children are using for drawing and for writing are appropriate for the strength and the size of the hand of the child. So we want our small children using pieces of chalk or using a paintbrush, for example, wider objects that provide feedback. We don't want them using narrow pencils and felt tip pens at that age. And the reason why is the hand is not yet strong enough. So what happens is the young child then will compensate by holding the pencil incorrectly. They'll hold it like this because their hand is not strong enough yet to hold it properly with the pincer grip. And we don't want that incorrect pincer grip to form. It's very hard to correct it after it's been formed. So instead, we want the hand to become stronger. And when the time is right, then the child moves to the pencil. So again, the tools that are good for the child's hand at the young ages are chalk or other big pieces of things that the whole hand can grasp well. And here too, your children's teachers can help support what are the particular things. Paintbrush, chalk are two that come to mind right now. We strive for language-rich environments, both in our schools and in our homes. And at the base of reading and writing is sound awareness. So children need the understanding and experience that words are built from sounds. So some sound games are important for young children and elementary children. And sound games simply mean oral activities, spoken activities in which vocabulary and sounds are explored. So in early childhood, we might gather up some objects, maybe 4 objects, like what you see here on the slide, and it's just the objects. So just you would, in real life, we wouldn't have the words printed there, but I've printed in there for a separate reason in a moment. We gather up the objects and say something like, I'm thinking of something that begins with the sound P. What am I thinking of? And it's very limited here, what you see on the tray. And the children might say plant. Later work is going to focus on the end sounds. So I'm thinking of something that ends in the sound ol, and they might say bell. Still further later work, the hardest sounds are the middle sounds. So I'm thinking of something that has an oo sound in the middle of the word. Yes, the loon. That's what type of bird that is there. That's a loon. So what I want you to notice here for the early work is we're isolating sounds, not letters. So I'm not referring to letter names here. We do not need letter names actually to be able to read. And teaching letter names early doesn't have a benefit the way the sound awareness does have a benefit. So we begin with just a few objects like this. So this might be a little activity for 3-year-olds with the beginning sounds, a few objects. Now, experienced children, they can think of things in a particular shelf or in a particular room. Children that already know their sounds might play some sound games in which they think of as many sounds as they can that have the same prefix or the same suffix or the same root. That's the kind of thing we might do with our elementary children. So how many compound words can we make with the word fish? I'll give you a moment to think of. Compound words are when we put 2 words that can stand alone and have their own meanings together and they mean something else. And you think of words that have fish. How many compound words? We can do the same way with how many words have the root port in them and generate a big collection. Report, transport, portable, etc., things like that. So these are the kinds of ways that parents can help with the work of the home for children. So not conventional homework per se, but help with that development of independence, love of learning at home. Of course, creative endeavors with the work of the hand, building and painting and those kinds of things as well. So let's turn our attention to technology here for a few minutes. As you know, the internet makes possible all sorts of really wonderful things, but at the same time, the pace and intensity can be a real obstacle to childhood. And there's lots of really hard and sad statistics about this. These days, adolescents, for example, are more likely to spend their time online and with screens than any other place. And this matters because the hours we're spending with screens, we're not doing other things. So the digital world offers new and quite different approaches for creative expression. So in essence, there's a new language for children to learn. So they need the same support from us in developing digital skills for communication and interaction that they needed when they're developing spoken language and written language and all of the other things. And both of these skill sets are becoming trickier to develop simply because today's children interact with human beings less than they did in the past. And even now in a pandemic, even less than they did before the pandemic. So our children have the capacity to make a great, great difference in the world. And technology could offer one avenue to do this in a positive way. So how can we enable children to make a positive impact through technology? What's our responsibility as Montessori adults that care about child development? So in short, what's the role of the adult here in regards to technology? So it shouldn't surprise you that our role is exactly the same as what I've been saying for the last few hours. Our role is in our session. Our role is to support the child's entire growth, emotional, social, cognitive, in healthy ways that lead to natural development. So again, as Montessorians, as Dr. Montessori said, our work is called an aid to life. Right now, life in the 21st century requires digital savvy. It requires internet know-how, and our children need to learn to navigate their worlds. So our job is to provide skills and practice as they develop independence in all areas, and this includes technology. So in particular, our elementary children, they need technological experiences that are developmentally appropriate. They need experience that adheres to Montessori pedagogical principles. So some of the principles I've mentioned today are things like limitation, development of responsibility and independence, integrated learning. And they need technology experiences that prepare them for being citizens of the world and citizens of the local society. So often this is articulated by our national curriculum. What are the skills that they need to be living in the community? So if we keep in mind the children's characteristics, we can see why some of the reasons why, there we go, some of the reasons why technology is so compelling. And one main reason is that children of this age are attracted to technology because they want to be socially connected with their peers. We know this social need already, right? They want to feel included. Second plane children, they thrive on, they need those social interactions. So we can consider their use of devices as an expression of a desire to connect with each other. So if you think about it that way, a desire to connect with each other, rather than simply a desire to use a device. So children have high standards and expectations for friendship. They feel the same way about digital friendship. You know, in their experience, relationships are built through digital as well as through face-to-face interactions. And the internet is uncharted territory with lots of possibility for exploration through reason and imagination. So of course, this is a naturally attractive environment for 6 to 12-year-old children whose impulse it is to explore with reason and imagination. So elementary children also like technology for entertainment, right? Just as adults do. They like to take pictures too. Often the reason that they take photos is to document and recall experiences. So parents often wonder, you know, at what age should my child have a cell phone? Or at what age should I allow my child to have an Instagram account, or whatever the thing of the moment is? And this depends not only on the child's maturity, but on the ways in which she will use the phone. Does she need it to be safe when she rides public transportation? Does she need calling capability only, keeping in mind that there are really no payphones anymore? Payphones are pretty much extinct. Will she need it to access the internet or to use apps, things like that? Another point to remember is that children do not love technology just because it's technology. They can feel overwhelmed and frustrated just as adults can with technology. And sometimes that happens when using technology takes more time than doing a task without it, or when devices keep them from getting personal attention from parents and from teachers. Children can feel frustrated just like adults do too. But when children can learn, connect, and create in ways they value, they appreciate technology just like adults do too. So just like all the other disciplines in the context of cosmic education, the broader aim of our approach to technology is to help the child with her development, to help her develop her fullest potential. We want to foster the child's sense of belonging in the world community, and technology could provide one way to do that. But our children need modeling. They need guidance. They need support. This is so they can build the skills they need to live as those contributing members. And here's where explaining what you're doing with your device in a very concrete way can help the children. They often just see adults, doing this with their phone, but they have no idea what's happening. And if you say, I'm making the grocery list, I'm checking the calendar to see if we're free tomorrow to have dinner with your grandmother, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, here, take a look at what I'm doing, then they can start to see, well, what are some of the uses that you're deeming appropriate and acceptable for that device? Because they're not typically seeing us talk on the phone. And most of the time, the phone is used for all sorts of other things. So what you're seeing here, there's a chart. I talked earlier about impressionistic charts. There's a chart called the fundamental needs of human beings that we use to tell lots of stories about how human beings all over the world have the same needs, but we meet them differently, past and present. So we have the same need for nourishment that our ancestors did and that our friends across the world have, but we meet it differently. Like what I ate for breakfast is different perhaps than what you all are going to eat for breakfast tomorrow, that sort of thing. So what the children have done here is made their own chart, the fundamental needs of the modern human. And you're seeing just a detail from the chart, and there's a little technology circle. There's no technology circle in Dr. Montessori's original chart. But what they're seeing is that's a fundamental need that they have as the modern human, though there's a little phone, a little laptop, I think, there. So finally, some concluding remarks here to tie together what some of the things we've talked about are. Our 6-year-old transitioning into a Montessori elementary class is ready to take on the universe. So she's outgrown her beloved environment of the children's house. This is that environment for the 3 to 6-year-old. She needs a broader environment in which to act and move and discover. And so our elementary communities provide this expanded opportunity, this expanded world. So we're opening up the opportunities they need to learn, to practice and perfect not only all sorts of academic things, but also the soft skills they need, not just to survive the inevitable fast-moving pace that we have right now in our world, but also to thrive by adapting themselves. So it takes courage to grow, to change, to adapt, daily courage in ways that seem small. This list was generated by a Montessori class of 6 to 12-year-olds, children that understood that kind of courage. These things take courage, right? Standing up for yourself, singing out loud, doing something new for the first time are some of the things that the children in this community knew. So again, takes courage to grow, to change, to adapt. So parents want many things for their children. Teachers want many things for our children. But the bottom line is we want our children to have a happy life. And we don't have to climb up on a tall mountain and ask the wise elder the secret to happiness, because Montessori has told us. Dr. Montessori has said the secret of a happy life, she said, is congenial work. That's what she said. So that is work that's suited to the individual's talents, personality, passions, but also in harmony with the community. So when we provide this important work for our children, we give them the foundation for an inner life of satisfaction and also an outer directed life of service. So it's been lovely to be with you today. Well worth getting up very early in the morning here. You probably noticed that it was very dark when we started. Now it's very light at my house, but I'm watching all of you. And for many of you, it was quite light when we started and now it's dark at your house. And that is the beauty of being able to connect from so far away. So that's the end of my formal comments.